Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight on this frigid evening. Welcome to the Women in Gender and Religion Forum number 3. And tonight we decided to take a slightly different approach than what we have had so far, which was a single presentation and then responses. The idea was to have a bunch of people up on the podium beginning with a number of thoughts, and then a plurality of voices in response to talk about issues facing the field. I think frequently of Luce Irigarei's striking comment that the questions of gender is really the pressing and burning intellectual issue of our age. The more I think about it, the more that I'm convinced that that's true. And especially for those of us in the study of religion, which, as we all know, in the humanities is the most interesting way to study the humanities, the question of conjoining, the question of gender and the question of religion together and how they interact with each other and what each can say to each other, and the importance especially of this approach in the study of religion is really the issue at hand for the panel tonight. The way the question was posed is, where do we stand? What is the nature of the kinds of things that we're thinking about at the moment? What kinds of investigations are we following? And what does the future look like? Where are we going? Where should we go? So we're going to listen to 5 very brief presentations, and then the floor will be open for discussion. So I think what we're going to do is go in order. We have the odd situation of everyone here's name begins with a letter that the sort of the highest letter is H. So we have a bunch of B's and D's and G's and 2 H's. So we're going to start with Anne Braude and go in order. We feminists really believe in order. So.
Yeah, don't we know? And may I speak from here, or should I stand up?
I think why don't you stand up?
Okay. We believe in order and podium. So we can be heard. Well, the way Janet first posed the question to me of our agenda tonight is what's interesting about conjoining religion and gender within the humanities. And as I just said to Ben, it's great to be speaking to the choir because... or preaching to the choir, rather, because, of course, my answer to that question was, well, what's not interesting? I mean, that, because as I think about the study of religion, and I think of religions as existing only insofar as they are able to reproduce values and experiences and moral frameworks, and that sounds like gender to me. The way I first got interested in the study of religion was really in a desire to understand the mystery of gender. What to me was a mystery of why or where we get our notions of what constitutes a good female person versus what constitutes a good male person, and how we got such distinct sets of concepts about those 2 categories, and how those came to be internalized at such a deep, basic level that we can't categorize any human being without those. And I think of those, the depth of concepts of gender as being right at the same level of human experience as religious ideas and frameworks and experiences. I think also of the constitution of gender as it's produced and performed and reproduced from one generation to the next as being transmitted in very, very much through the same process of the transmission of religious ideas. And so the whole arena of family and child rearing and social, the institutions through which we reproduce our value system seems to me to be very parallel in the study of religion and the study of gender. Now, Janet also urged us, as well as being brief, which I will be, to be bold in and perhaps provocative in talking about what interests us in the study of religion and gender. And so I thought I would talk about some of my more unfashionable interests. Of course, most of my interests are unfashionable, but I think the new work in religion and gender that interests me the most is that helps us to revisit the major arcs of historical narratives. And I think of Joan Kelly's classic question here, did women have a renaissance? A question, and we've had lots of questions from lots of people bringing up new perspectives, bringing gender into the study of history and religion. And as I travel around to different groups who are interested in religion and women's history and speak to them about my own work, I often hear back, well, here's how we've been left out of the narrative. Here's how the women in our group have been left out of the narrative. Here's how we've been silenced or made invisible in this way and that way. And what I always want to say to all of these groups, and most recently I worked with the Christian Scientists as a consultant on the new Mary Baker Eddy Library. Last summer I spoke at the Mormon Historical Association. And as I hear these a variety of groups wanting to come into a public conversation about how they've been misrepresented, what I want to know is, well, if you were part of the conversation, if your experience and particularly the women's voices in your group were accurately represented, how would that change the large historical narratives? How would the big issues look differently? Did women have a renaissance? How would we start to rethink the Reformation, these large arcs through which we understand history? Now, the reason I say I think this is unfashionable is that as director of the Women's Studies and Religion program, I get to read a diversity of faculty comments on a diversity of proposals, the vast majority of them unsuccessful, for people who are engaged in the study of religion and gender. And there are a few recurring dismissals that I read from faculty. And one of my favorite dismissals is, this is a mere work of recovery. I've
probably written that, but anyway.
I don't think you have. But
no, I don't think I have.
I don't think you have yet. Given enough years of responding to proposals, these things all come out. But I really am stopped by that. And what that usually means when the faculty reader or some other expert that we have consulted writes, this is a mere work of recovery. It means it's not theoretically significant. It's not making a contribution on an abstract level. But it always worries me when we can't engage in mere works of recovery, because we have a lot to recover. And it seems to me if we can't recover women's experience and thought and action in the realm of religion, that then it's very hard to reinterpret or to stand back after we've accomplished that act of recovery and think about how the narratives really will be reshaped if women's experience is included. I think it's very easy to see in the present how women's issues and experience and gender and sexuality are shaping religion right now. It's very easy for us to see this as we look at Islamization on a global scale, it may not be easy to understand it, but it's easy to identify it as an issue. I think it's also easy to see in the Catholic Church in the United States in the contemporary period. Just to throw out a title, one of the questions Janet asked is, what do you like in new work in this area? I like Leslie Tentler's book, Catholics and Contraception, An American Story, where we really get to see how decisions about birth control, ostensibly intimate, private decisions shape relationships to religious authority, both for individuals and for clerics who have to counsel both women and men in the confessional, and therefore have to think about their relationship to religious authorities who aren't giving them anything that is going to work and is going to address the situations of the people whose confessions they're hearing. So we can see how something that starts on this very, very apparently private level eventually is going to hit the whole hierarchy of religious relationships. It's easy to see this continuing in contemporary Catholicism in the current crisis over the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. And I'm convinced that these correlations that we can see here in the newspaper are not new. That is, the relation between the private and what goes on in the magisterium, between women's bodily experiences and how they have to mesh that with the religious concepts and values that they're dealing with, how that then relates to major interpretive issues for the church and the viability of structures of authority themselves. I don't think these are new connections. I think they're just easier to see in the contemporary world than in further historical settings from which we are further. I'll just mention one other issue that really compels me in bringing religion and gender together, and that's the issue of agency. I think this opens up the question of agency in a new way. Women's agency, certainly, because we really have to view women as subjects if we're going to include them as believing agents acting on faith, negotiating and navigating religious systems that may not appear to affirm or empower them, and this is one of the this is part of what makes this interesting to me, is that it's so problematic that when we get inside women's religious commitments and expressions, that over and over we see them being emboldened and empowered and embracing meaning systems that apparently subjugate them. And so the conjunction of religion and gender constantly draws us into this apparent contradictions, that religions are depending for their existence on the body, the group of people, the majority of their participants, women, who they are excluding from power and subordinating. And so that's when it gets interesting for me. Thanks.
So last semester I taught a course in the Yard for undergraduates on the Bible and sexuality, and of the three kind of interlocking categories that Janet gave us of women, gender, and sexuality, my comments are going to focus somewhat around that course, but particularly on the category of sexuality. In that class, the the students ranged the gamut from LGBT activists to those with quite conservative sexual politics and religious convictions. At one point, towards the end of the course, we were reading a range of scholarly positions on Romans 1 in the New Testament, which is arguably the most significant New Testament text for thinking about same-sex desire and sexual practice. And we read a whole spectrum of positions. The stuff we were reading on the conservative side maintained the basic trans-historical stability of categories like male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, and then argued that at the end of the day, for the Apostle Paul, and this is quoting Richard Hayes, who's a scholar at Duke, homosexual relations, however they may be interpreted, represent a tragic distortion of the created order. But it's interesting that the articles we read on the left didn't perform the flip side of this move, which is to say, they didn't start with naturalized or essentialized notions of sexual orientation and then argue for a reading of Romans 1 that creates a space for a particular kind of same-sex relationship in the modern world based on a monogamous heterosexual model. The most famous version of that sort of argument would be that Paul is not arguing against homosexuality, quote-unquote, as we know it today, but against heterosexual persons engaging in homosexual acts. But that's not the position that these articles took. We were reading some things by Bernadette Bruton and Dale Martin that sought to denaturalize categories like sexuality and gender, pointing to the very different kinds of cultural logic, sexual politics, and gender hierarchies that drove the ancient Mediterranean world. And then the problems that this creates for bridging the hermeneutical gap in contemporary appropriation of New Testament texts. So that's all well and good. That's what we were doing in the course. A few days later, I received an email from a Harvard College freshman who'd been deeply impacted by this reading. And I just want to read you a little bit of what he had to say. He said, of the articles we read, the right-leaning ones were very into practical applications for how gay Christians should live, in other words, celibately, and how heterosexual Christians should interact with their gay brothers and sisters. But the left-leaning ones treated the issue more theoretically, pointing out that things aren't as clear-cut as Richard Hayes or Cardinal Ratzinger wants to make them. I found the stances taken by the more liberal articles really interesting, but my concern is that this is not just a theoretical issue. For every homosexual Christian, there are actual choices about living life that have to be made. So it seems like it's a lot more urgent than coming to the conclusion, well, it's really complicated. Now, this is an issue that scholars like Bruton and Martin are well aware of and have attempted to address in other works. So I bring it up not as a critique of them, but rather as illustrative of an intellectual and ethical dilemma that seemed to cut through virtually every aspect of this course that I was teaching, which is to say, what's at stake in how we think, talk, and teach about the intersection of identity, identity politics, and religion. The majority of undergraduates in my course came in articulating a confident and comfortable range of essentialized sexual and gender identities. Identities uncritically rooted in authoritative discourses of biology, nature, and or the created order. And they were accustomed, on both the right and the left, to using these stable and grounded notions of identity towards practical ends, activism, community building, and choices about religious and bodily practices. So that's how they came in. But a big part of what they got in the course from me was exposure to critique in what we could call broadly a sort of Foucauldian or Butlerian paradigm. Foucault's famous assertion of the historical contingency of homosexuality in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, ends up being part of a larger project that questions the basic gender binary on which the fixity of a term like homosexual, or for that matter heterosexual, is predicated. So there's space here, to use Butler's term, for gender trouble, for exploring the performative aspects of gender, of sexual identity, the possibilities for subversive appropriation or resignification of norms within the dominant discourse, imagining new technologies of the self, new economies of bodies and pleasures. And in the context of a course like the Bible and sexuality, possibilities for complicating how all this relates to religious identity and the interpretation of authoritative texts. there's a lot in that trajectory that I see as unambiguously positive and useful, insofar as my students and I all occupy multiple and shifting identity stances. And this trajectory offers analytical tools for negotiating the textured complexities and the ambiguities that do constitute human embodied life. But the question that I was left with, and that others have been as well, is what happens in the face of this sort of radical decentering to possibilities for activism and for ethics that no longer have a foundation in stable, naturalized identities. As Leo Bersani acidly points out, if we gays and lesbians are indeed everywhere, it is by no means clear anymore exactly who the we is. What it means just to be gay has become surprisingly problematic. For Bersani, there's what he calls a de-gaying aspect to this nexus of theoretical strategies that's commonly termed queer theory. And what's potentially troubling here is, quoting Bersani, that in rejecting the essentializing identities derived from sexual preference, these sorts of analytical strategies mount a resistance to homophobia in which the agent of resistance has been erased. There is no longer any homosexual subject to oppose the homophobic subject. So there's no easy answers, obviously, to these sorts of questions. Butler asks a tough question when she wonders, how might we encounter the difference that calls our grids of intelligibility into question without trying to foreclose the challenge that the difference delivers? And recent work of hers and others is attempting to think through constructive possibilities for moving forward here in terms of ethics, moral philosophy, and political action in rigorous and sophisticated ways. How politically viable those attempts are going to be remains to be seen. But as for where the study of religion might intersect with this conversation in ways that I find interesting and potentially useful, there's a need in this discussion to take seriously, to my mind, the stuff of religion, texts, practices, concepts, as constitutive of sexual and gendered identities. That is, embodied subjectivities that are religiously inflected. What I'm interested in here is the kind of historical sensitivity, cross-cultural awareness, and decentering leverage that careful comparative work in the study of religion can provide. Eve Sedgwick's famous first axiom in Epistemology of the Closet is that people are different from each other. Thus, identical genital acts mean very different things to different people, and some experience their sexuality as deeply embedded in a matrix of gender meanings and gender differentials, while others do not. To my mind, any viable sexual identity politics has to wrestle with this point, and the study of religion, broadly conceived, can potentially add much nuance and richness to the discussion. How am I doing on time? Okay. I was going to leave out something about psychoanalysis, but I'll go for it. A related corollary that's become very important to me recently has to do with the psychoanalytic tradition. I was taught as a beginning graduate student in religion here at Harvard, as well as a budding historicist, that this tradition of intellectual inquiry, even in its most sophisticated continental varieties, attempts to be universalizing, transcultural, ahistorical, and as such is irredeemably problematic. But I don't agree with that anymore, insofar as a thoroughgoing culturalist position can only take us so far, and isn't able to engage very effectively with the multiplicity of ways that bodies can actually matter. This, to my mind, necessitates the need to turn to concepts like the psyche and the unconscious, not necessarily as transcultural givens, but at the very least as analytical structures that, while not without their problems, remain a useful place for trying to think through the mediation of culture and bodies, rather than reducing the discussion to a single pole. Freud had radical insights into the primary variability of human desires. And while he didn't develop those implications in those insights in his own work, I think that there are potential avenues here that are worth pursuing. And it's my hunch, or at least my hope, that bringing this into conversation with the study of religious cultures, discourses, and subjects in their various historical particularities won't render the psychoanalytic irrelevant via the standard historicist critique, but that rather the study of religion might offer a kind of pushback against a certain Euro-American-centered reading of the psychoanalytic tradition, thus opening up critical space for recognizing and engaging with modes of embodied subjectivity that might otherwise be rendered invisible by whatever normative discourse one finds oneself within. So obviously that doesn't solve any problems. I think that there's probably still a place for strategic essentialisms in sexual identity politics, at least provisionally, because to say otherwise seems naive and overly utopian with respect to the world we actually live in. But perhaps one role we have to play as teachers and scholars at the intersection of religion, gender, and sexuality is to model for our students how to negotiate contextually and think critically about the multiple registers in which identity projects can be pursued. I resonate with Butler as she tentatively suggests that when we ask what makes a life livable, it may be that what is right and what is good consist in staying open to the tensions that beset the most fundamental categories we require. That probably isn't the kind of answer that my college freshman was hoping for when he asked for a progressive vision on the Bible and sexuality that pushes past the conclusion that things are just really complicated. But I think that there's all the same an open and urgent question here about whether this is the direction that we ought to be moving. Thanks.
Everyone, a multiplicity of voices, and you've already heard two very different approaches to a seemingly similar topic. Anyway, I've not been introducing people, so that was Divinity, who is, your status is...
Director of Undergraduate Studies.
Director of Undergraduate Studies and a recent PhD, right, from the Committee for Study of Religion. And now we have Elizabeth Gish, who is a master's student going for her MTS. MDiv, sorry.
That's good.
Identity is very fluid.
Ben's talk was a great segue into a lot of the things that I'm going to touch on in a similar way, but in a little bit of a different context. I want to touch a little bit on feminist theology and queer theology, two areas where women, gender, and religion intersect, and the areas that I'm most interested in and most familiar with. I began in a university environment in 1997, which is unbelievable to me that it's been that long. And I'm not completely sure my sense of queer theology, how much of it is I was just becoming more familiar with the field over this time. But more so than in feminist theology, I feel like I've seen a shift in queer theology since I began. And I imagine it's probably a combination of both, somewhat of a shift in the field and me just learning more and being around longer. And while there are many different discourses and discussions going on at one time, it seems to me that earlier in the discussion of sexual orientation and religion, the conversation often came down to, in many ways, we want in and we want to be treated equally, and the other side saying we don't want you in, or yes, you can come in, but you can't be equal. So it was kind of a very binary approach to that intersection. And queer theology, while not diminishing this need at all for equality and to have everyone be included, to let everyone in, so to speak, the queer theology moves the discussion in a little bit of a different way. And Laurel Schneider framed this really well in an article called Homosexuality, Queer Theory, and Christian Theology. And she points out that queer theologies and theories go beyond just the let us in and you can't come in discourse, and instead, and I'm going to quote here, takes on the whole paradigmatic system of meaning that produces heterosexuality and homosexuality in the first place, and tends to view religious ideas as cultural means of productions of the system. Queer theory then disrupts not only homosexuality as a stable signifier for particular groups of men or women who consider themselves to be homosexual, but also disrupts the stability and natural givenness of heterosexuality as well. And I would add to this that the importance of queer theory more broadly in theories and discourse on gender is destabilizing not only what it means to be straight and gay and some of these more relatively static categories, but it's also had the effect of continuing and furthering feminist work about what it means to be female or woman. Queer theory and gender theory have blurred a lot of boundaries, and boundaries that have many have found to be oppressive, and we're very glad to see blurred. This said, I want to highlight what I see as a danger that comes with increased focus on queer theory, queer theology, and gender gender theory as these big categories that we spend our time giving attention to and transforming and writing about and analyzing. Namely, that this destabilized, troubled, questioning framework is not on the radar for most people in the world. I know it's often pretty dangerous to make generalizations about the whole world, but I think here it might be justified. I think that most women experience themselves as ontologically women. I am a woman, and men, I'm ontologically a man. I want to stress that I don't think that there are many exceptions to this. I know, and I think it's that this is not completely universal, but it's just so common. And I like to bring in here what I call the Aunt Barbara factor. Like, if I always think of my Aunt Barbara as kind of the everyday person to think about when I'm thinking about theories in relation to reality. And I think if I told my Aunt Barbara that not only is her gender a performance, a construction, but also her sex is a performance or a construction, I assure you that this would not go anywhere with her. And I don't think she's an exception. So I see our future work as needing to attend to two related but not completely identical concerns. One is, of course, let's continue to keep gender theory and queer theory and these issues that we've been talking about on the radar and central to our areas of interrogation, study, analysis, and reconstruction. But I also think that as we think about women and gender and religion, as we move forward about this, we need to think about how we talk about this. I'm not sure if it stands out to others here, but our Women, Gender, Culture PhD, THD programs are Women, Gender, and Culture. This is the Women and Gender Forum, and it's the committee that puts on the Women and Gender Forum, and the Committee on Women and Gender puts on the Women and Gender Forum. The point is, we have lots of women and gender stuff, and feminist is nowhere in there. And of course, I see the importance of feminist theology and theory as saying that we have something. We're not just talking about things that are out there, but we have a statement to make, and things need to change. And even though we would say a lot of people doing women's studies and gender studies think things need to change too, that's not implied in how it's named. And if you would say, well, it means the same thing, well, then why isn't anything called feminist around here? And I think that it's not quite the same. So we can't be neutral while things go forward. In our university, our classes, our lives, we're constantly experiencing experiencing at the same time reinscribing what it means to be a man or a woman. And right now, despite the amazing strides we've made in the past 50 years at HDS of women being here, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think before we get too caught up in giving all of our energy to troubling, as it is often said, troubling gender and sex, we need to continually remind ourselves that these identities are still having very real consequences for women in the world, and feminist theology is explicit about seeking equality for women. It's normative. It says this is how things should be. We take women's absolute equality in the eyes of the divine, and we take the value of freedom and dignity and choice and hope and equality for the world, and specifically for women, as central to the project. I want to note and stress that I'm not implying that women's studies and gender studies don't do this, but rather I simply want not to lose the basic critique that feminist work brings to this as we venture into this new and exciting territory. I see the importance of giving attention to feminist theologies as reminding us that we would like to transform possibilities for doing sex and doing gender, but that this is probably a long time in coming. I look forward to the day when sex and gender and bodies are seen within this complex matrix of various equally good, equally valuable variants and ways of being and combinations. But in the meantime, sex and gender and bodies carry with them a lot of baggage. Well, I think the work that queer theory and theology has done in questioning the binary sex and gender distinctions and the attention this work has given to embodiment, I think we can sometimes forget the lived experience of most women and men in this world, which is one of being stuck unchangeably on one side of a sex-gender binary. And the picture, especially for women, is not pretty. I want to make room for those women in our work that aren't going to be moving back and forth or feeling like that's fluid. Some of you may be familiar with Martha Nussbaum's article criticizing Judith Butler's work very amazingly harshly. And based on my limited knowledge of the article and Butler's work, it was a very strong misreading, maybe, of Butler's intentions and work. So aside from the point of her article criticizing Butler, I found something very helpful in her article in reminding us to remain focused on what is practical. In critiquing Butler's work, Nussbaum writes, "Hungry women are not fed by this. Battered women are not sheltered by this. Raped women do not find justice in it. Gays and lesbians do not achieve legal protections through it." While Nussbaum expresses what I think is an important forefront to keep in the forefront of our work, that feminist and queer theory should not be a site, an intellectual playground for academic elites. There's real and serious work to be done in eliminating suffering, transforming oppressive religious structures and institutions, attending to people who are hungry, marginalized, aching. While I distance myself from the conclusions of Nussbaum's work about Butler's work, and I in fact think Butler's work has done and continues to contribute meaningful practical ends for women, albeit indirectly, I embrace wholeheartedly, and I think that as we look forward to where we're going, I encourage us as an area of study to embrace wholeheartedly a call for us to keep the lived experience of women as a background to what we do. Will our papers given at AAR transform things, bring about a revolution, or the ones we write for our seminars? Maybe not specifically, but in writing those, we transform ourselves and contribute to the public conversation about what's going on at the nexus between feminist, queer, and gender studies and religion. I just encourage us to keep in mind the Aunt Barbara factor and all the other Aunt Barbaras out there who so much need for those of us in places of privilege and power to continue to work on opening up possibilities and space where the everyday lives of everyday people can be transformed in meaningful and material ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have Professor Amy Hollywood.
Hi. I don't think I can read what I wrote here, but okay, I'm going to try. Mine's an Aunt Pug factor. I have an Aunt Pug. She's no longer alive. But my Aunt Pug factor works very similarly to your Aunt Barbara factor, and in ways that actually intersect nicely with some of the things I wanted to say. I think that one of the reasons Janet asked me to do this was because I've been teaching this big class on sex, gender, long class, it's never ending, on sex, gender, sexuality, and the study of religion, and trying to think analytically about these distinctions between sex, gender, and sexuality, where they can be analytically distinguished, where they seep into each other in ways that are ineradicable. And one of the things that came up as we were talking about some of these issues last term was my sense that in the arcane realms of theory, but also in the lived realities of very marginalized persons' lives, there has been a shift, or there is a space for thinking about multiplicity at the level of sex and the level of sexuality. That at the level of sex dualisms are undermined simply by the biological facts of human existence. It's a small percentage of persons. It's a small percentage of persons who are only now beginning to find an actual voice and a political voice for themselves. But one of the things that the intersex movement has demonstrated is the inadequacy of thinking about sexual differentiation in terms of simply male and female, and the very deep injustices inscribed on people's bodies by non-elective surgeries that are performed upon children who are born intersex. And one of the things that some of the primary activists in the intersex movement are trying to get people to think about is about what it would mean to live in a society in which there was a space for thinking, at least of a certain percentage of the population as not being encapsulated within that dichotomy between male and female. and what would be the ramifications of allowing the space for that to become possible. Similarly, when we think about the politics of sexuality in the last 30 years or more, if you think about the proliferation of letters in the LBGTI groups of different, it used to be lesbian, gay, then you get bi, then you get transsexual, then you get intersex. There's this proliferation, and I keep wanting somebody to add an F for the fetishist groups, and I'm not joking, I'm joking, but I'm not joking, because it seems to me that one of the things that is enabled by some of the recent contemporary theories, and also and even more crucially practices of sexuality, is a recognition of the multiple ways in which we live our sexual identities, ones that are irreducible to the homosexual heterosexual divide that has really a product in many ways of the 19th century medical discourses. So that one of the things that I think we can see when we look at the issue of sex on the one hand, when we look at the issue of sexuality on the other, is that there is already in practice real people living lives that are irreducible to the dualisms by which we understand them. So it's not, Elizabeth, this is going to sound like I'm bossing you. I don't mean it like that, but I can say to my Aunt Pug, it's not just about theory. Like, you have to find a way to understand how these people are living, and to find a way within your conception of what it means to be a Christian, which was very important to my Aunt Pug. Somebody named Aunt Pug has to be a Christian, right? What it means to have a place for and to think about the realities of these multiple forms of sex and sexuality. I know exactly what you'd say about the sexuality issue because I heard her on it, but that's another issue. But the dualism that seems to me to have be both in practice and in theory, not intractable, but the most intractable, is the gender dualism, is the divide between masculine and feminine. So that even the multiplicities of sexuality that people are living tend to get read in terms, often by practitioners themselves, in terms of masculinity and femininity. The ways in which we occupy our bodies tend to get read in terms of masculinity and femininity, even if our bodies don't fit within putative distinctions between male and female. And it seems to me that gender dualism has been the most recalcitrant, and it is currently the site, I think, of some of the most exciting political work that is being engaged in nationally and internationally. And I'm thinking here about both the intersex movement and the transgender movement, and the complex relationships between the intersex and transgender movements. And one of the arguments that some of the key sort of spokespeople for the transgender movement are making, Ricky Wilkins is somebody that I think of here, is the claim that transgender politics is feminist politics, it is sexual politics, it is intersex politics, because the transgendered persons who are living embodied experiences of gender that are irreducible to the binarisms that have so often and historically contained us are demonstrably no longer adequate. And one of the things that I find a little frustrating, and I think is the space where new kind of theoretical work has to happen, is the tendency always to fall back upon it's a male, female, man, woman. Do you know what I mean? You always come back to masculine and feminine as this terminology that we can't seem to escape from. And we need a new language. We need new ways to think about what gender identity might mean, or alternatively, we need to get rid of gender. I know that you can't do that, right? Okay. I keep hoping we could somehow do that. We could just have sex and sexuality, and we just could not have gender. So there's a radical questioning of gender dualism going on in this space. I think there's really interesting issues to be raised about the deployment of religious imagery and religious practices within the transgender movement, especially among some of it's most visible in some of the autobiographical writings coming out of the transgender movement, a tendency to fall back upon, even as one is critiquing certain kinds of religious imagery, most often coming out of Christianity, but not only out of Christianity, what work that religious language, religious imagery, religious practice is doing within the context of the transgender movement and transgender politics, and what kind of both theoretical and practical work it is engaged in. At the same time, I think that this is a space where two poles of my sort of political investments and intellectual investments are most at odds with each other. Because on the one hand, we can look at transgender politics and see it as a radical questioning of the dualisms of sex, gender, and sexuality. All of that is happening within this space. And we can see a certain resting upon and making use of and subversion of religious language and religious imagery within and practices within that movement, and yet very much at the margins and at the very margins, if not the outside, of mainstream religious traditions, in particular Christianity. My Aunt Pug would not recognize this as anything she wanted to call Christianity, right? But so that's one pole. On the other side, I find myself very much sharing a deep commitment to something. This ties to something you said, Anne, to thinking about women, gender, and religion in the context of the simple fact that religious identity, both individual and communitarian, is central for so many women worldwide, and the need to try to understand and begin to think through the political and intellectual implications of the fact that many women are embracing meaning systems that apparently subjugate them. That's the language that you used, Dan. I'm just citing you there. And so that what do we do with, and how do we understand, and how do we begin to think in critical and yet also, I don't want to say appropriate because that sounds bad, critical and constructive ways about the role that religion plays in the lives of so many women worldwide. Now, the question for me is, okay, you have these two different domains of discourse in which religion, gender, and feminism play a role, but whether those two movements are deeply at odds with each other is an open question, and whether in fact the commitment to attempting to understand the politics of religious identity as a central site from and out of which feminist work must be done doesn't in some ways or isn't in some ways immediately raising a challenge to some of the presumptions about the naturalness of sex and gender and sexual dualisms that are central to many who are standing within mainstream, if to use the bad word, religious traditions. And I like what Elizabeth said about we need to think theologically in terms of transformation, and feminist theology is a site of transformation. But my worry is, what do we do with the religious person, the religious woman, who does not want to be transformed in these ways, who does not want to engage in this kind of critique of sex, gender, sexuality, and their dualisms, but instead sees those dualisms as central to their own understanding of themselves as a religious person? How do we try to work with and around and think through the inevitable, I think, loggerheads one's going to come to when certain kinds of radical critiques of sex, gender, sexual dualisms come into contact with aspects of religious traditions in which those dualisms are understood as crucial and central to their theological conceptions of themselves, their communities, and their worlds. I think there's been a long time in which we've liked to think about those issues as epiphenomenal to what's really true in religion. It's not really working, right? Because for many people within religious traditions, those things are not epiphenomenal to what is crucial to their sense of religious identity, religious community, and their nature of their relationship to God or the divine. The place, I think, where we can begin to think about these issues in a constructive way, not in a way that's going to resolve them, but in a way which helps us think about the intractability of the problems, is by thinking about the nature of bodily practice as constitutive of one's identity, both as a member of community and individually. Bodily practice as constitutive of emotional, affective, and intellectual ties that cannot be undone simply through argument, that cannot be undone simply by demonstrating the truth or falsity of X or Y position. Where, am I going to my Aunt Pug and saying, look, there are people who are not irreducible to this form of sexuality, in no way undoes her repugnance in the face of forms of sexuality that she sees as unnatural and necessarily condemned by what she understands God to be. My poor Aunt Pug, she's been dead for so long that I feel like I can expose her in this way. But anyway, so those are a host of questions, and I do think that it's by trying to think about the way in which rational arguments based on political goals and agendas or intellectual agendas are not going to work. But we have to think about the deeply embodied nature, both of the what you might call habitus of religious persons, but also of intellectuals, of feminists, of those engaged in liberal Christian theological projects. All of us who are engaged in these debates are inculcated with certain ways of responding affectively to the world, finding certain things to be repugnant or unthinkable. And we need to kind of think as richly and thickly as we can about the nature of our embodied reason in order to begin at least to see the site of intractability and begin to make some kind of progress in towards thinking about how those sites of intractability might be pursued and might be resolved. I mean, I don't see resolution on the horizon, but we can at least begin to think about the issues more creatively and more tactily. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Maybe you just gave us the reason why you're and repugnant.
Oh, good.
Nan Hutton finally is a PhD student, so final comment.
What a esteemed group of colleagues to come last after. We're very fortunate to have such a group of people not only on the panel but in the audience as well. We're all such, I know we're all giving a lot of thought and careful thought to these questions that have been raised for discussion tonight, and we're fortunate to be in a community that encourages these conversations. Thank you for fostering this group along so that we can have these conversations. 6 years ago, when I was deciding on what to major in as an undergraduate, I chose the study of religion because it seemed to be the broadest backdrop against which to think about women's cultural roles and experiences. At the same time, the study of religion was cross-disciplinary. Virtually any other academic discipline could be brought into play to investigate, analyze, or interpret what we call religious. More specifically, religious symbols, icons, laws, and rituals are often gendered. A male god, male priest, sacred texts that privilege male religious roles and experiences. These contribute to, obviously, the construction and performance of contemporary gendered roles and the regulation of sexuality, particularly women's sexuality. And while the fruit of women's womb is often defined as being part of her divine purpose, everything else about her reproductive and birthing cycles and processes are often seen within religious rhetoric as being unclean, impure, and polluting, or to borrow one of Professor Hollywood's more technical terms, yucky. Of course, the religious obsession with sexuality is not just about women's sexuality. Currently in the modern West, we can see how religious rhetoric would regulate all sexual expression that does not conform to heterosexual unions within marriage. Additionally, in some conservative or fundamentalist traditions, this means that the sanctity of marriage trumps women's safety within that marriage. Women often lack religious institutional support in protecting themselves and their children from an abusive spouse. These are often the same fundamentalist religions that insist on the sanctity of all life, negating women's rights to choose whether to abort an unwanted or handicapped child, placing an ultimate value on the child over the mother's physical, psychic, economic, social, or other conditions. Other bioethical concerns, including stem cell research, organ replacement, often implicate religion as well as the bodies of individuals. And a moment more to talk about babies. Cute little cuddly wuddly babies. In the modern West, an infant's gender is fixed at birth, regardless of whether one subscribes to a particular religion or not. If you have a baby, you pretty much have to decide right then and there whether it's a girl or a boy, and sometimes following that assignment with the appropriate corrective surgery to modify baby's genitalia to meet normative standards. I can't comment exactly on how this fixation on instant sex identification is related to religious discourse, but certainly Bible stories about Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark point to a tradition where people and animals were sexed in one of two ways. And if a child was a boy, glory hallelujah. And if, girls just seem to get screwed. One could explain all of what I've just described as being categories of patriarchal discourse, history and politics, dominated by men with women as unequal participants. While this may be true, some argue that this position may also serve to reassert the Western discourse that creates and maintains these sharp polarizations between men and women. Others assert that universalizing sexual differences runs the risk of effacing all other differences. Still others would critique the idea of women as victims or passive recipients of male actions. As long as we continue to believe in society as being us versus them, whether we are speaking in terms of sex, gender, class, ethnicity, race, abilities, or any other partisanships, we will continue to strive against each other rather than valorizing mediation and compromise. Shouldn't we be celebrating our difference and diversity? That's what we have in common with each other. That we're all profoundly different. Hooray for that! Let's figure out how we can be productive and harmonious and fulfilled while asserting a universal us that encompasses all of the earth and all of creation, not privileging the human as the master over an enslaved and defiled creation, but as partners and caretakers with all that shares the universe with us. Therefore, I get excited by the potential of contributions that continue to destabilize the foundations of duality and redeem the so-called other from heteronormative, monotheistic, male-centric discourses. To that end, I hope that the field of women and gender and the study of religion will continue to welcome a variety of voices that will represent our human diversity so that we can expand our intellectual field of endeavor and gain critical mass and momentum in rocking the boat of hegemony. While I could go on and on about women and gender studies, I think of no better way to end my comments than by quoting from Adrienne Rich's 1971 essay, When We Dead Awaken, writing as revision. Quote, "Revision, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction is for women more than chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. Until we can understand the assumptions in which we are drenched, we cannot know ourselves. And this drive to self-knowledge for women is more than a search for identity. It is part of our refusal of the self-destructiveness of a male-dominated society. A radical critique of literature, feminist in its own impulse, would take the work first of all as a clue to how we live, how we have been living, and how we have been led to imagine ourselves, how our language has trapped as well as liberated us, how the very act of naming has been till now a male prerogative, and how we can begin to see and name and therefore live afresh. A change in the concept of sexual identity is essential if we are not going to see the old political order reassert itself in every new revolution. Here's to the field of women and gender in the study of religion. Here's to the revolution."
Thank you all so much. You surpassed my wildest dreams of what this panel could be with really a great set of comments. I want to especially just thank Anne Braude for her first, I think in some ways, lucid and perhaps simple but very, very true point that religion is in many ways about the most basic thing in the world, and gender is indeed also about the most basic thing in the world, and maybe that's a key to what's really at stake in our work. A lot of what we've been talking about tonight has been about identity. I'd like to point out that Elizabeth Gish was on the very committee that named this committee, and so that the absence of the word feminism, she probably has something to do with it. On the other hand, it was really interesting that last year when we first started out with this project, we spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out what name we should have. And so indeed, I think it's germane to the entire endeavor is having a problem in naming oneself. I myself am going to resist offering a Buddhist philosophical response to what is something that Buddhists talk about all the time, which is namely how you can indeed have agency, and in fact better agency when you have a destabilized identity. That's not a problem. But I won't, I will not engage in that, but I'd like to instead throw the floor open really had some rich comments here, so lots of things to talk about. So people who want to raise questions in general or address them at any one of the speakers, please.
Okay, so I have no ant name to tack onto this comment, but let's say I think that this came out of trying to think about Elizabeth and Amy's comments in relation to one another, and the idea, because I'm trying to imagine who my Aunt Barbara would be, and one of the things that fascinates me about this theory is that I think it does name reality for so many people, but they resist that naming. In other words, let me take my grandmother, let's say, someone whose life I knew very, very, very well through stories. But I imagine that my grandmother may well have had another life too. I could imagine, so this is like an Irish Catholic woman from Brooklyn, grew up, born in 1904, who got married at age 27, which is pretty late actually for that era. And then lived a long life with a very patriarchal sort of husband, and then, at the end of his life, he became very sick, and for the last 8 years, she took care of him and was in a very different role. So what's interesting to me about that is, there's a possibility, I think, I can imagine that my grandmother had other kinds of sexual experiences, may not have been genital sexual experiences, but affectionate relationships with women, for example, that might have involved eroticism, that she would never in any way claim, right? And that, and then also that she sort of, would think of herself ontologically as a woman. Anyway, all this speaks to Amy's. I was really fascinated, Amy, when you said that line. Maybe we could just get rid of gender. And I thought, well, that's just so crazy to think we're ever going to get rid of gender. Why? Because we do keep returning it, but why does that comment make sense? Well, because it's not adequate to our experiences. And that tension is what I think we're trying to get at, of thinking people actually don't live in this world in stable ways, but they think they do, and they are intent on seeing it that way. And that seems to me then that the dual purpose is to both make that visible, and that's the work of theory, right? That's why theory is real world work, I think. On the other hand, we have to find a way to see, and so that it would be that our goal should, I think, ultimately be to see that agency can come best from a destabilized self. And I guess I don't think we're at a moment where that is very politically efficacious, but I think I'm older than Elizabeth, but I've come of age at a moment in feminism where feminism fails because it has, I think, in many ways failed to be convincing because it was normative and paternalistic, paradoxically, or ironically, and that I guess this is to say that I know I would not be able to make my grandmother. This would not make sense to my grandmother as a way of talking, but I think it may in fact well make sense of my grandmother's life, this way of destabilizing. And so I guess, this then turns out not to be a question, sorry. Yeah, but just a hooray for destabilization, and with a really, taking seriously Elizabeth's caution of where that leaves, Ben's caution too, of where that leaves us. Without right now a politically efficacious stance, but I think that's okay. I think we can, because a politically efficacious stance can be very doctrinaire and can be a power grab, and we need to do that too. But we need to sometimes step back from that. So that's my comment. Could any of you like to help me by transforming it? Anybody respond to that?
Very good, thank you. I agree.
I guess I want to think more. I don't have an answer to this question, but I want to think more about that claim that thinking about agency as enabled by a certain kind of destabilization of subjectivity rather than harmed by it is not right now politically efficacious. Right now in this, right in this particular context of, in what context? Right now being, when and where and how, and this is part of my whole, sort of intellectual as opposed to just you're being nasty beef with Martha Nussbaum and her critique of Butler, is that I think that what she doesn't see is that Butler's speaking in part to and from and for communities for whom her work is having an immediate and intense political impact, and whose lives are fractured and decentered in certain ways, and yet are also the site of enormous kind of political force and political agency. So that to refuse, and this is what worries me, is that it really more than worries me with Nussbaum, it kind of enrages me with Nussbaum, is to refuse to see that, is to once again radically disenfranchise, politicize, and abject those who are on the absolute margins of our contemporary cultural practice and imaginary. I don't think that's what you were doing, Elizabeth, at all. So don't mishear this. But I do think that's the big problem with a certain kind of liberal and even a certain kind of quasi-socialist feminism that has been repeatedly critical in more or less generous terms of Butler's position, that is unable to see the fact that there are those who are agents out of destabilized and or unrecognizable to the political sort of center subjects who are living, who are surviving, who are engaging in practices that are enabling and I don't know, creating a space in which they can be, in a way that was not the case 40 years ago. So what does it mean to shut down that possibility? What does it mean to say, oh, well, that's not really happening, or that may be happening, but that's irrelevant to us at the center of what constitutes feminism? Just say that's my part of my worry. Ben, you're looking at me like I'm being crazy.
No, I'm with you in a lot of ways, but that destabilizing also then destabilizes categories that are doing efficacious political work, right? In certain...
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Are those categories? There is, in fact, if we are to say there is efficacious political work being done under the banner of some of these categories, is it work that could not be done if those categories were destabilized? That's the claim that is repeatedly made. I'm not convinced of the salience or truth of that claim. Nobody's tried. Nobody's thought about what it would mean to allow those categories to become destabilized and find other ways of articulating what certain kinds of political vision would be.
I want to add to that. One of the questions that can be asked is whether Butler's work is groundbreaking in theoretically, or whether in some ways she theorizes something that was already happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it seems to me, again, I'll say from a Buddhist perspective, if one is talking about destabilizing basic categories of identity, that's the most difficult thing that one can possibly imagine. We have such an entrenched world history in being tied to the notion of identities being stable. So, from my perspective, actually, first of all, that what Butler talks about is not only in theory. I think that we are seeing it in popular culture, in images, and the way people are looking and thinking about themselves in major ways, and not just in the West, but around the world. And that one can say that actually there is a lot of ways, in fact, in which we are living those destabilized categories and coming to understand them. It's not the case that we've completely won over the entire world, or all the implications of what that means have been realized. But one read is that, in fact, there is enormous amount of efficacious kind of change happening. Who knows why? Who knows why we're at the place that we're at now? You can think of someone like Butler as just simply theorizing something that is actually happening in the world. But I think actually that the question that Butler raises, which is true, so one read is that this is happening, and it's going under the banner of a non-banner. We don't know how to name it. We don't know how to label it, precisely because it's happening in all these sort of very generalized ways. I think one of the questions that Butler raises is the real problem. Nonetheless, I think it's close to maybe what Ben is talking about, is don't we still need to have those categories on occasion, these strategic essentialisms? I think that was what you mentioned as well. And that seems to be, maybe that's one important route to explore what it would mean to really sort of self-consciously have these strategic essentialisms that one is using politically, and at the same time having a conscious of also knowing how constructed, in fact, that it is, and how contextual and provisional that it is.
I was interested why you haven't looked at the other side of the discussion. I mean, at the same time as gender was becoming very acceptable as tool of analysis in the academy, there's a whole other direction of feminist theory which argued that gender, race, class, colonialism cannot be treated as separate categories, but they need to be understood as intersectional. And so for me then the question is, in terms of destabilization and strategic essentialism, how much does actually race stabilize the understanding of gender in a certain way, namely gender construction for a certain group of women or men, and how much does class again inflect gender or doesn't? So I would like to hear a little discussion on that. And then my second question is, how come you all talk about your aunts and your who are long dead, and you don't talk about your children and grandchildren, and how we would need to rethink religion in terms of the questions raised and identity formation?
I'll just respond quickly that my Aunt Barbara is quite alive,
It's only mine.
and has three children, and I interact with them all in kind of a Southern Baptist context, and so I don't think it's just her. I would be talking to my cousin Graham, or any generation that's from that perspective that my Aunt Barbara kind of represents to me.
My question is, why should we take people as who are set in a certain kind of understanding of religion as well as in a certain kind of understanding of gender? Why not look to the future? What are the possibilities of the different theoretical approaches for future, and what would they do in terms of students, children, or future identity formation?
I hope that I talked to some about what I see in the future in that, but I understand your point.
Elizabeth, you ask these questions in such a way as if there's this, I don't know, this necessity for confrontation that over these issues, and I find it really hard to. I find it easy to respond in one way. I'm like, intersectionality. My way into that is via issues of sexuality, and yes, we also always have to think about race and class and gender, but we can't keep all these things at once in our head, and we can't pretend to. And there's a kind of a dream of omnipotence that we'd be occupying if we purported to talk about all these things at the same time. I could go on and go down that road and give that answer, and class. Is a crucial category for me in light of much of this thinking, because I think that religion and class go hand in hand, or religion and status go hand in hand as sites of tremendous under-theorization within contemporary feminism that have to be taken on board if contemporary feminism is going to be speaking for women worldwide in the ways that it purports to be doing, or is going to be useful to women worldwide in the way it purports to be doing. Okay, that's that. And in the future question is one that one can give a certain set of responses to. But I think that what's bothering me in the way the questions are framed is that the questions are framed as if what we're doing as feminist scholars or as people engaging in women, gender, and studying religion, always is going to be looking for the new next thing, And I think that's right. I think we want to, well, okay, you shake your head, but it seems to me that we have to think about the people to whom we are speaking or to whom we would like to be speaking and the world we would like to be transforming in terms of what is around us and who we are living with and who we are engaged with in the world. So, which for me doesn't rest well with saying, well, I'm normatively going to prescribe for you what your children should be thinking. That just does not, well, and that's what it sounded like.
That was not my question.
Okay.
I had two different questions. So one question is that I do not think that white feminists can go on talk just about gender without recognizing the broad and wide literature and discussion which is parallel to the gender discussion on the intersectionality of structures of discrimination.
Right. That's a question that I answered.
That is the one question. The other question was in line with Elizabeth's question of transformation. We need to do studies about, yes, how your aunt so-and-so and your aunt so-and-so use their religious practices or religious whatever to reinforce their gender identity. That is a valued area of study. Mm-hmm. But I think if we think in terms of transformation, we also need to see whether or where religion offers possibilities for transforming intersectional structures of domination. That was my question. So that's why I said look into the future.
I think those are both great and important things to bring up. So thank you for that.
We've got some other comments from the floor if people want to join in. Raise questions. Take a chance. Do it.
It's interesting being here at Harvard because I feel like these questions are really discussed and they're very important. But if I look in general at the field, I wonder how much, for example, if I'm not writing a dissertation here, how I will be supported in raising some of the questions about gender and sexuality that I'd like to raise, and I don't know, I'd like to hear about people's strategies it also seems to me that this has been, even within Harvard, that this, creating this forum and all of that, there's been some tension with other people in the university and even in the Divinity School who don't think these issues are so important anymore. And it's just an issue, I guess, not a question. But how does one deal with critiques that issues of gender and sexuality are not central, or that they've been that certain things that you've discussed are sort of have crossed a lot of generations of concerns, and
is it worrying you? I mean, when you ask them the strategies, you're thinking about sort of concrete strategies for how one would think about.
I was just recently told by someone who I might work with on a dissertation, for example, if I was not here. Yeah. Recently mentioned in a class, hypothetically, a particular individual in another school, said in class, I'm not interested in gender.
Right.
I don't get it. I'm just not interested. I think it's not an interesting question. And so just personally thinking about, what would one's strategies be? Why? I mean, obviously I know for me why it's important, but it seems to me to be sort of a tender place. As much as queer theory and all that, and even in queer theory, there are people who will say, well, that's very 90s, yeah. We're not interested in this anymore.
getting murdered for, crossing a little boundary with gender. I don't know that anyone can say that it's not a current issue. I find that really hard to. It's obviously such a huge issue. So my response to your possible new professor who said that is to laugh. That's ludicrous. I would just make fun of that person. That's what I'm talking about. Confidence in your undecidability,
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I might have a different strategy. I think that all of us who've been in this business for a while have been in that spot, in that classroom or seminar or graduate program or department or university or city or church where gender was dismissed. And I guess rather than laughing, it could be a good strategy, depending on what your alternatives are. Excuse me. But I think this is one of the reasons that feminism as a term doesn't appear in so many program titles, that there's a combination of issues that have come up today. One is and my guess of why this person claims not to be interested in gender is not because they're not interested in gender, because you can't read the newspaper, I don't think, and not notice that gender is costing people lives, it's costing people countries, it's in the middle of everything. I think what that person is probably responding to is something that Connie Fury referred to about feminism failing to be convincing because it is perceived as a paternalistic or a closed, I don't know if closed is the right word, or it's perceived as a set position that is not adequately open to permit of intellectual development. I'm not saying that I know any feminists who have that view, or that that there's any reality to that. But I think there was something to Connie's point of, and we all, everyone who considers themselves a feminist suffers through being told by other people that, well, I'm not a feminist because I don't hate men, or I'm not a feminist because of some other idiotic misconception about what feminism is. I'm not a feminist because of some definition that no feminist ever has articulated or claimed. But nevertheless, we live in the world where these ideas are abroad and are salient. So I guess my strategy in that situation, it wouldn't be my first choice of doctoral program, but if it was my best choice, I would just prove that it is, and that's where prove that gender is salient for the issues that scholar cares about, because it is, for sure. I have no question about that, and that any scholar that is really worth studying with can grasp that at some level. If it's, I shouldn't say at some level, but can ultimately grasp that if it's demonstrated well enough. So, I mean, I would, and this, this also speaks to, well, why are we talking about the past? I mean, to me, I think it's great for me to hear theologians talk about the future, which in history or social science we call that hypotheticals, versus things that can be demonstrated by data. But we don't do that where I come from. We don't speculate about what what might happen if we did X. We try to see what has happened, and people have identified with stable categories. They have. We have a lot of evidence for that, a lot of evidence for its political efficacy. So I think this is a long way of saying that we need to, in addition to gender theory, we need the disciplinary tools of whatever other arenas we're operating in. And we need to use them really rigorously in order to be able to not only work with gender, but continue to make the case. Because I hope that we're not just going to be talking to each other, that nobody in this room is always going to be in conversations where the salience of gender is a given and doesn't have to be argued for in some way.
I'm wondering if I can put a different ant analogy on the table. Instead of Aunt Pug, how about an Aunt Jane? It's not her real name, but it's a woman in her late 60s who lives in South Bend, Indiana, who grew up under a system prior to the psychological movement of the diagnostic manuals, and who went through shock therapy because she was a lesbian. She came out of that and became a nurse and met her partner, spent 20-odd years together before in the early 90s, for the first time to another couple, they came out to me and my partner at the time. They've been together for 20 years. That Aunt Jane is also on the table. It's not just the normative Aunt Janes we think about, but it's the very people in our lives, the ones that Butler is trying to give voice to. That some of the theory may seem abstract, but for every abstract academic who talks about it, I can name a handful of folks who are actually living that, whose gender identities didn't fit the mold, and in extreme cases were in the medical science of the day, were told they needed to. And so just to lay the other side on it, that sometimes we, living here in Boston and Harvard Square, we think all of that didn't exist or we're way past all of that. So I would throw that on the table just as another reminder of some of what we're fighting for.
There's also this interesting aspect of polygenderism. It sort of almost kind of ties in with what Amy was saying earlier about eliminating gender. It's this aspect that we all go through fluid gender identifications of our own, and not in terms of necessarily, as children we are practically genderless, and then again as we grow old we kind of lose gender markers that would have us be identified one way or the other. So it's just another aspect of all of these things are so variable and so mutable and fluid that to try and think that there's only two or that we will remain whatever it is that we were assigned, well, it's just silly.
But I just think it's important to keep in mind that that's not necessarily the lived experience of so many people. So to call it silly, on one hand, I hear where you're coming from, but also I think it's important to remember that it wouldn't seem silly at all to lots of people who don't feel like it's fluid at all. So.
I think a piece of Elizabeth's leading now, but I think a piece of what I was thinking about before also was to push that even further, I guess, to push that point, Elizabeth, that I take from you, and I actually strongly agree with you a step further, and to say, even, the way Elizabeth reformulated a question in terms of where does religion offer the possibilities for arguing against the intersectional forces of oppression, absolutely, politically, I'm totally with that in my own politics. But the fact is that when we begin to look at the ways in which people live their lives religiously, there are many religious women who have a set of values that are crucial to their understanding of themselves and their world, in which that's not their particular political agenda, or that's not the way they would term their political agenda, even if they might share some of the same values about feeding women and fighting poverty, and do you know what I mean? And so one of the challenges for me, or I don't know if this is my work or one of the things that I'd like to spark other people to do, but one of the challenges I think for scholars who are thinking about this in terms of contemporary politics is how do we find the language that is going to speak across those differences towards the things that are shared agendas, but without presuming a language of liberation, of emancipation, of fighting the oppressive forces of intersectional identity and colonialism, etc., that are the language that within the academy that we presume as that which will bring us together as feminists or as women, but is not necessarily the language that's going to bring women cross-culturally, oppressed people, hungry people, poor people cross-culturally together. Do you see what I'm saying? And then when we look to religious traditions, we find people who have a whole nother, and it's not just a vocabulary, but it's a lived experience of value that may have points of strong coalition with feminist politics, but because of the hegemony of a certain kind of feminist political voice, have led women within religious communities to say, I'm not a feminist and I don't want anything to do with feminism.
Do you think there are limits to the possibilities for those kinds of coalitions?
Sure.
How would you articulate?
Well, that's my worry about that. That's why I think sexuality for me becomes one of the key issues, because I think, when it comes to issues, I think very specifically about examples in my life experience where people who, on issues of class, on issues of race, they'd be right with us all the way, but it comes to sexuality and the door shuts. And that's important, that within the confines of much, and I'm just going to talk here experientially, U.S. Christianity, that's where the door shuts. And so what does that mean? And what does that mean about the kind of coalitions that we can build cross-culturally, within our own culture, but also cross-culturally outside of the U.S., and where they're going to be viable and where they're not going to be viable. And sexuality is, for me, sexuality is part of this debate about intersectionality, and sexuality is the one where the door shut down. So, I don't know what you do with that other than say, that sucks.
I was just going to add, and yet I think the door shuts because, as Anne said, people are identified with stabilized identities. And yet the reality doesn't always match the image. So people are struggling. They're identified with stabilized images. They're identified with stereotypic gendered images. And yet bodies don't conform to stereotypes. They never do, for any of us, over the course of our lives. And lives don't conform to stereotypes. And so coming from just being here this semester, coming out of a community, a religious community, people are struggling in their lives and in communities and in religions because the real experience doesn't match the image, the things they're identified with. And so I guess my comment to all of you is that you're doing important theoretical work for all of us out there, and people are looking for answers. And I would encourage you to keep looking for those. I don't have the answer to the language problem, but keep looking for for new terms and common terms, and while still working with the reality. It's a paradox. The reality, as Anne put it, is that gender does still affect people, and people, are affected by gendered and dualistic determinations. But at the same time, the reality doesn't fit. So it's a constant tension.
We are dwindling in numbers, but we're not getting more theoretical. We're getting more realistic as the night goes on. But anyway, maybe we should come to a close now. Obviously, the conversations that have been started are going to be things that we're all thinking about. I at least found this a really, really productive and thought-provoking night. So I want to thank especially the panelists for really 5 great presentations, and for the audience for hanging in there. And we'll see you again.